This season is all about reworking ancient or traditional ideas with a modern feel. I'm Katie Hacker, your host, and joining me today is Laura Poplin with a combination of leather and chainmail. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks for having me, Katie.
Oh, it's great. And you know what? I love the idea that you bring these two together in such a beautiful way. You've really done some dramatic finishing techniques on your leather.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're going to learn in our next segment how to join these, but today we're going to talk right now about making the tiles.
Right. I start off with a regular piece of leather, and sometimes it's a little bit uneven, so I even it up and to a square, and I'm using a cutting mat to help me make a straight 1 inch by 1/2 inch rectangle for my bracelet. So I end up cutting a strip, and what I wind up with are two little strips that are 1 inch by 1/2 inch.
Okay, now is it important what kind of leather you're using for this?
I actually use the smallest, thinnest leather that I can find at the leather store.
All right.
So I'm going to move my cutting mat away and to my craft knife. So the first thing I do is I take a dauber and I dip it in my leather dye. When I dip the dauber in the leather, I kind of squeeze out some of the excess, and I'm using a scrap piece of leather to get the excess out. So I'm just going to dye. I use a circling motion when I dye the leather and dye the edges.
Okay.
It doesn't really matter if you dye the edges first or the front.
Would you normally be wearing gloves for this part?
I would.
Yeah. Okay.
So now the leather dye, it dries very quickly, so you don't have to worry about waiting any length of time before you do the next step, which is actually gluing.
Okay, well, before we do that, let's show here, you have two samples that are already dyed.
Right. These samples are, it's much easier to dye a larger piece of leather. So what I normally do is if I'm using if I'm using the same color for a bracelet, I'll just dye all the leather on one piece and then cut it afterwards.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you can do it all at one time.
Right.
All right. So once we have our two little pieces together.
Well, the next thing you want to do is protect your hands from the glue, because the glue is very sticky.
Yeah, we don't want to glue our hands together.
Right. And then also I protect my surface. It's very important to protect your work surface from the dye and the glue, because if normally a master leather worker would have a big slab of a marble, and that way he could protect his work surface. And if he had a spill, he would be able to just clean it up very quickly.
Oh, okay.
So now it's time to glue, and I'm just going to turn my pieces over. Take my glue. And this is contact cement that you get at the leather store. Regular contact cement will not work properly.
All right, so you want to be sure that you're using the kind that's meant especially for leather.
Right. And I'm using just a cheap brush, because you really can use a brush only one time. So I'm just putting it on there very evenly. And make sure you get the edges.
All right, so you just want to make sure that you have a coat on both pieces as well, right?
Right. And then you wait, after I'm finished applying these contact cement, then I'm going to wait just a few seconds, and you can tell when it's kind of setting up, because it'll lose the shininess and it'll be kind of clear. So when you're applying it, it's white. So I'm just going to wait a few minutes, for about a half a minute. Doesn't take long.
Okay. So, you know, we're showing a lot of finishing techniques today for how to do this. But when people are getting started you could create these tiles to really join them together with lots of different kinds of jewelry. Because like, for your example, the bracelet that we have and also your necklace, you know, all these techniques are using these small tiles of leather that you're creating.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. All right, so it looks like our glue is drying a little bit.
Okay, so now I'm going to take each piece in my hand and I'm just going to eyeball it to make sure that it's even. When you have gloves on, it's a little bit tricky sometimes because it's hard to hold on to these little tiny pieces.
Yeah.
So then you smash them together. Okay, then I'm going to take a brayer and roll the leather just to make sure that it's all flat and sticky together. Now I'm going to take back my cutting mat.
Do you need this?
I do need the cutters. And it's important to cut the corners from a leather piece because they will actually curl up if you don't. So I'm just going to cut the tiniest little piece off of each corner.
And that's helping your two pieces to stay together.
Right.
All right.
Okay. So now you can tell that it looks a little rough. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sand the edges. Now you can also use a grinder if you're using a larger piece of leather, but a grinder is a little bit rough for this tiny little delicate piece of leather. So I'm going to smooth out the edges.
Would you use the same technique when you're making other things as well besides the little tiles?
Yes, I do. I've made larger pieces of leather, like kind of a collar necklace with chainmail on it, and I use the exact same technique. Although some of my bracelets, I put metal in between the leather, so it gives it a little bit of stability. Like one of the bracelets, well, both of those cuff bracelets have metal in between the pieces of leather.
So then you can really shape it to the wrist too.
Right.
All right.
So you just want to make sure when you're sanding, and this is just a regular nail file that you can get at any drugstore. So I'm just making sure that all the little fuzzy pieces are off and that the corners are rounded, but not too much, because you still want them to be a little bit of a corner.
Okay. And then what do you have to do to seal the edges?
Well, right now they still look a little bit rough. So the next thing I do is I take my beeswax and I rub the beeswax all around the edges of my piece.
And that kind of smooths it out and holds it together as well.
Uh-huh. And this is the real amazing part. You take the edger, which you can get at a leather store, and there are 3 different sizes. I'm going to use the medium size for this piece of leather because there's 2 together, and you just rub the edger around the edges of the leather.
Now, and also you're showing us how to make one piece here, but if you were doing this whole bracelet at home, would you do it assembly line style, where you kind of do each process?
Exactly. Makes it go a lot faster that way. So you just keep rubbing it around a little bit, and sometimes it takes a while.
Yeah, you can see that it's really starting to smooth out.
Mm-hmm. And the next step is to take some sheep's wool that also you can get at a leather store, and you want to rub the edge of the leather into the sheep's wool.
And that's kind of sealing it again with the lanolin from the wool?
Right.
Or using it as a buffer?
Mm-hmm. It just kind of buffs it both, I think.
Okay.
And then I just rub it a little bit on the furry side of it.
Yeah. It really shines it up.
Mm-hmm. And then you can see that the edges are nice and smooth, and it's pretty much finished except for making the holes. And to make the holes for the bracelet, since this is 1 inch by 1/2 inch, I can just use the grid on the cutting mat to line up my holes.
Okay.
Now, another thing that when you're working this close, it's nice to have some magnifiers so that you can see properly.
Sure.
So I'm just putting one directly in the middle and then as close to the end as I can get.
Perfect. And then it looks like you also have some ideas for distressing this. Do you have to let it completely dry before you can do that?
Not necessarily. It's pretty much dry at this point. And then what I like to do is take just some sandpaper or a file and sand off the edges. So I'm sanding and just getting some of that dye off so that it's not exactly equal.
It also gives it kind of a vintage look when you're working with it that way.
Right. Another thing I do is that I use some antiquing fluid that you can purchase, or you can make your own. And if you would like to have a different color. Another option is using leather paint, and that's made especially for leather. And it's nice to you can rough that up probably even a little bit better than the dye.
Oh, okay. So you would just put it on and let it dry and then rub some away with the steel wool or something?
Right.
Okay, so like the necklace you're wearing, that looks like the same technique. You've dyed your leather and then painted over the top.